When people die, it's up to the rest of us who are still here to tell their life stories. That's how they live on. And that's why we call this podcast Immortalized.
Welcome back to Immortalized. I am Steven Siegel from Legacy.com, the world's largest network of obituaries. I'm here today with Linnea Crowther, Legacy's news editor and lead obituary writer.
Hello.
So Linnea, last month, we did an episode of this podcast where we went through a whole month's worth of headline news obituaries, and we highlighted the ones that received the most condolences in their online guest books.
We did, and I thought it was a really fascinating snapshot of what people care about. So we didn't just see which obituaries people were responding to, but we also heard all sorts of interesting reasons why those people who died were meaningful to them.
That was who died in July. Since then, in August, we published 59 news obituaries at Legacy.
Right, and for context, that's pretty much within our usual range recently of how many well-known national figures die in any given month. Usually that number is a little higher in the winter and a little lower in the summer, and that's because statistically more people tend to die when it's cold out. But this summer has not been particularly slow.
So today, let's take a look at those August obituaries. Out of the people whose deaths made headlines, who had a particularly large outpouring of condolences in their Legacy guest books? And what sorts of thoughts did people have to share about them?
So what do you think? Should we talk about the 10 most active guest books from August?
Yeah, let's do it. So we're going to start with Jeanne Robertson, who first became known when she was just 19 in 1963, when she won the Miss North Carolina pageant. And in doing so, she set a record as the tallest contestant ever in the Miss America contest. But then she went on to have a long career as a humorist, which really took off over the past dozen years or so when her videos became a big hit on YouTube.
You know, I was not surprised to see that her guest book was one of our big ones this month because I saw so many comments on our Facebook post about her and on our weekly video that she was featured in from a few weeks ago from people who just loved her and really felt personally saddened that she had died, that they would never get to see more comedy. They were, expressing condolences to her family. And so I am not at all surprised that that's the same thing that I saw in her guest book. Jeanne Robertson's thing was she did not consider herself a comedian. She was a humorist because she told stories. She wasn't telling jokes. She told stories that were funny, but they were 100% squeaky clean. She never told a story that you couldn't tell your grandma and feel good about it, And that was what I saw people talking about, both in those comments and then in her guest book, that her comedy was clean, it was uplifting, and in a lot of cases that it helped people feel better in a personal hard time. So here's one. My husband and I have loved her stories. She has had me in tears laughing many, many times. I even tuned into her YouTube bits during COVID quarantine from her back porch and found comfort that others outside my little circle were experiencing the same loss of normal.
It's very personal, isn't it?
It is. And it was so recent, she was right there with her fans so recently in a time that was hard for, the whole world. And that's something that's going to stick with her fans for a long time. Here's another one that was similar. Times were tough. I had forgotten how to laugh. While surfing on YouTube, I came across someone who made me scream with laughter and nearly fall out of my chair. I have been a fan of this amazing woman ever since. She brought me back to life, and I smile whenever I think of her.
It's really sweet.
Yeah, she meant so much. I've got one more along those same lines. In fact, I have several more, but I'm going to keep it to one more. I recently discovered Mrs. Robertson's videos on YouTube and cried with laughter, something that doesn't happen very often, especially as my daughter died, aged just 36, 4 years ago. I'm so sad that a wonderful talent has passed and send condolences to her family. Her legacy will live on in these videos. She clearly helped a lot of people through hard times by telling these funny, family-friendly, squeaky clean stories that made people fall out of their chair and cry with laughter. Everybody said that.
I'm struck by something in there that I feel like we see with a certain amount of regularity in the obituary guest books, which is people who have experienced a personal loss in their own life,
Mhm.
feel this drive to express their feelings all the more so when someone who they might not have known personally dies. The empathy is a little bit more intimate.
There is, and there will be times that this celebrity who has died really brings to mind their loved one who died as well. Whether it's here, where Jeanne Robertson's comedy helped her get through the loss of her daughter, or we'll see people who really connect their lost loved one with the deceased celebrity. I watched her TV show with my dad, and so anytime I see her now, I think of sitting down with dad and watching her show, or whatever that personal connection is.
Another obituary that received a lot of passionate condolences was for Tony Esposito, an NHL hockey player who played for the Chicago Blackhawks for 15 years.
They called him Tony O, and his fans loved him, as we saw in the guest book. A lot of people thought of him as their childhood hero. A lot of people who, maybe played hockey as a kid at the time that he was on the Blackhawks, they would be Tony O when they were playing hockey with their friends. And then some people who were able to meet him in person said that he was a really great down to earth guy as well, something that we saw in a lot of guest book entries. So here are a few entries from Tony O's guest book. He was a classy guy, an absolute joy to watch, and a real gamer. What a wonderful role model for preparation, longevity, and giving it all he had. There was no half stepping with Tony. The proof is in all the best wishes, memories, and sadness expressed from all his admirers. I wonder how many people chose to play hockey because of Tony's influence. And now here's one from someone who did do that exact same thing, who said, a true legend, my boyhood hero. I spent many days being Tony O in our street hockey games growing up in Toronto and Orangeville, Ontario.
There it is.
Yep. And one more from his guest book. Tony Esposito was a name I grew up with. My dad was an avid Chicago Blackhawks fan, and we spent many a night gathered around the television watching them play. We had a tabletop hockey game, and of course, Tony was in the net when we named our little steel men on the ice. I was fortunate to have met him in person a few years back. He was so kind and took the time to have an actual conversation with me. No big ego, just a big heart.
It really underlines the fact that sports is a world where a lot of people, and particularly men, feel free to express themselves emotionally in ways that maybe they don't in other areas of life.
Yeah, we certainly see that in the guest book and, on our social media when a really beloved athlete has died. It really brings out that emotion in our male readers for sure.
Another field that really stirs up people's emotions is music.
Oh boy, have we seen that! I mean, last month when we were talking about Dusty Hill, people were emotional about his death. He had been playing music in their lives for like 50 years. And that's the thing. It's in your life. Songs like form a soundtrack to our memories. Whatever we were going through at a specific time in our life, it's so easy to associate that with the songs that we were listening to at that time.
Several notable musicians died last month, and one of the most famous was Nanci Griffith, the country and folk singer-songwriter.
Nanci Griffith was not a superstar. I am sure that there are people listening today who maybe haven't heard of her and certainly weren't familiar with her music, but she had a really devoted following, and there were people who loved her, who felt a very personal connection to her through her music, and that was what I found several times in the guest book. They felt like they knew her from loving her music for so many years. So here's one. I never had a reaction to the passing of a musical performer like I had when I read of Nanci's passing. I just sat there in my living room and cried. Nanci held a special place in my heart and was such an inspiration to check out many folk music performers that I never would have known of. She was a great teacher. I saw her many times when she played up here in New England. Nanci's voice was angelic, just the right amount of twang mixed with the perfect amount of little girl lilt and innocence. I loved her dearly and will miss her.
I felt like we saw that word angelic a few times in her guest book.
Yeah. Yeah, well, and it's spot on. If you're not familiar with her music and you like folk and country, you should listen because she really had a beautiful voice. Here's another entry from somebody who felt such a personal connection. I feel like I almost misread this entry when I first looked at it. Here it is. Nanci, you were my best friend from the age of 13 until now at 44. I knew all your songs by heart and knew that you knew me too. With your music, you came into my broken home and my broken heart, and you sang over me and around me and inside me. I thank God for your heart. You were kind and honest with us. You were willing to trust us with your own broken heart. Thank you so much for caring about us the way you did. I wish I could give you a hug and say goodbye. I love you very much.
Wow.
I know. When I first read this entry, I thought, oh, we're getting a comment from someone who was her best friend in real life from childhood. And then I realized, no, this is not the case. This is someone who loved her music so deeply that they felt that this singer was their best friend. And that, I feel like you can read between the lines and hear that this is someone who had maybe a hard life and that Nanci Griffith's music has helped.
It's powerful.
Yeah.
And part of that I think comes from there were so many comments talking about what an evocative storyteller Nanci Griffith was in her
Mhm.
music. And we also saw that with another great country songwriter people said goodbye to last month, which was Tom T. Hall. Fans called him the storyteller with capital letters for classic country songs that he wrote, like Harper Valley PTA, which was a number one hit when I think Jeannie C. Riley sang it way back in 1968.
Yeah, and Tom T. Hall also wrote for some of the absolute greats of country music: Johnny Cash, George Jones, Loretta Lynn, Waylon Jennings, Alan Jackson, the list goes on and on. But he was not just a songwriter, he also recorded his own music. One thing that it was just making me laugh as I read the guest book, Harper Valley PTA, of course, is his probably most famous song, song title. Everybody knows Harper Valley PTA, right? But so many people in his guest book specified that their favorite Tom T. Hall song was his song that he recorded, Old Dogs, Children, and Watermelon Wine. I probably saw that song cited like, I don't know, 2 dozen times in that guest book over and over. People really loved that specific song. So I had to go listen to it, of course, and it is a great song. I won't repeat all of those, 2 dozen entries that cited that specific song, but here are a couple more from people who loved his music and talked about it in the guest book. As a small 5-year-old, I had the pleasure of watching you perform at our local fair, and to top that off, I was able to meet you and get your autograph. I Love was the biggest hit about that time, and it was the time I fell in love with country music. I'm now 55, and I still love your music as well as all country music. Thank you from that little girl from 50 years ago.
That's an entire lifetime of appreciating what this one person did in their life.
And someone who makes a big impression on you at that young age really can stick with you and just become, the soundtrack of your life, like we were saying before. Here's another one who talked about loving Tom T. Hall for a very long time. Still grieving the loss of the man who wrote the story of my life over the decades. My wife and I were true Hall heads, as T called us. We followed his tour locations for many years and were so blessed to really get to know him personally, being backstage and on the bus repeatedly, having lunch, and appearing on stage with him a couple times. He is irreplaceable.
We see time and time again these stories that people share in the guest books that they're remembering so warmly when someone dies about having met them either in person or through correspondence, and just really being touched by the kindness that they're being shown by someone who they may not have known in real life, but who they've had in their, in their head and their heart as a fan for a long time. And so these moments really stick with them.
It's a big deal when you meet someone in person who you love their work, their music or their acting or their writing. And then when it turns out that they're also this very good person, you get a chance to see that, it sticks with you for a long time.
So another person we saw those kinds of stories for in his Legacy guest book is the actor Ed Asner, who was most famous for playing Lou Grant on the Mary Tyler Moore Show, and who died in August at the age of 91.
Yeah, Ed Asner definitely seems to have specialized in playing these curmudgeonly guys, Lou Grant, Carl Fredricksen from Up. Of course, they both had, a tender heart underneath that grumpy exterior. And it seems like maybe that's what he was like in real life too. Now, I do know not everybody loved Ed Asner, and that there are certainly people who took issue with his politics and didn't like him because of that. But he had a lot of fans, and I saw in his guest book how much they loved him and how thrilled they were when they got a chance to have a personal connection with him. So here's one of those. I once wrote to Ed Asner asking for an autograph. It was for my brother Dave, who acted as an elf in the Stratford, Connecticut Shakespeare Festival back in the late 1950s. Mr. Asner was there, appearing in one of the Bard's plays. I mentioned this to Ed, and he not only sent an autographed photo, he penned a note saying that Dave was the cutest elf of all, far cuter than his brother Bill. How sweet and kind of him. Funny, too.
That is funny.
It is. And it seems like an actor or a celebrity could just send that autograph, and the person who received it would be delighted that they got an autograph from this star. But to go that extra mile is what makes it very memorable. And I have another entry about Ed Asner going that extra mile that I think is my favorite guest book entry from this month. It's a kind of a long story, but it is worth it. On an overbooked flight from Charlotte to Hartford a few years back, I almost got bumped to the next available plane departing. I was in a complete panic and in tears because I was desperately trying to make it home to Vermont to see my little grandmother before she passed. An older passenger heard the phone conversation between my sister and I, with me explaining that I might be arriving later than expected and my worries that I wouldn't get to see or say goodbye to our grandmother in time. Unbeknownst to me, that gentleman talked to the gate attendant and explained my situation. The attendant approached me with the news that I would indeed be on that flight as originally planned. She then pointed to the elderly passenger and said I had him to thank for putting in a word. Imagine my surprise when I immediately recognized the man that helped me. I will forever be grateful for the kindness that he went out of his way to extend to a stranger, and will always remember sitting next to him on that flight and talking like we'd known each other for years. Rest in peace, Ed Asner. Farewell, Lou.
What a lovely story.
I know, I love that one.
I love these stories where all of a sudden, out of nowhere, here is someone lending a hand. No one was waiting for Ed Asner to come solve this problem.
No, and who's probably the most unexpected person on that flight to step in and solve that problem? The celebrity. But, apparently such a good person that he couldn't help trying to, use his influence as a celebrity to make a difference in this woman's day and life.
So Asner was one of those people who had such a long career making art that people loved. And that seems to be one factor we see at work in just how deeply fans feel about him.
Yeah, we saw a few of those this month. People who had loved this person, or loved their work for pretty much their entire life. Another one was the singer Don Everly.
So Don was half of the Everly Brothers, who were one of the singing duos who really shaped the entire field of rock and roll right from the beginning, with songs from the 1950s like Bye Bye Love and Wake Up Little Susie and All I Have to Do Is Dream. They were really there from the jump.
Yeah, those are songs that not only were influential on the development of rock and roll, but are also, still so good and so well loved today. They've stood the test of time, both for rock and roll music in general, and also very much for fans of the Everly Brothers who have been listening to their music for decades. And here's one of those. I was so very saddened and heartbroken to learn Don Everly passed away. I wake each morning listening to the music of the Everly Brothers and go to bed listening to their music. I will truly miss Don. I will miss seeing new photos of him when he would shrug his shoulders to the beat during certain songs. Like most girls, I too was in love with these two very handsome and talented boys, Phil and Don. I'm so happy to see all the photos that have been taken during the Everly Brothers' career and which have been shared with the world. Wonderful memories for all their fans to view. Even at my age, I find myself shaking my good knee when doing dishes as I listen to the Everly Brothers heavenly harmonizing and guitar picking and strumming.
On the one hand, that is such a passionate super fan memory. And on the other hand, there's something in there that we see, I think, a lot in guest books, whether they're for famous people or not, whether they're for family members. She explicitly called out the fact that she found joy in seeing what other people were sharing here in the guest book.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there were quite a few photos in this guest book, so that must have been what she was talking about, scrolling through the guest book and seeing all those photos. Here's another fan who loved the Everly Brothers for a long time. The first concert I ever saw was the Everly Brothers at the Utah State Fair in the very late 60s. I was only 6 or so, but it influenced my musical selections for the rest of my life. That's a long time to love a band like that for your entire life, your entire thinking life, really. Before 6, you don't really have musical taste. There was one more entry in this guest book that is a little bit different, and that it really hit me hard when I read it. I sang All I Have to Do Is Dream to my wife on her deathbed, and I know she heard and listened to it. So now the song has a double meaning for me. God bless the Everlys and their family.
It's really powerful.
Yeah.
One of the things we see at Legacy on a regular basis, I think, is that there are a lot of people looking on the internet to try to get ideas about what songs to play at a funeral, what songs are appropriate to share when someone is dying or has died, and will help everyone share their love musically.
Well, and there are some songs that are, kind of funeral standards that you certainly, might expect to hear at a funeral and feel right when you hear them there. But that's not the only thing that's available to play at a funeral. You can play what is meaningful to you and what was meaningful to the person who's gone. And, I could see maybe that this fella played All I Have to Do Is Dream at his wife's funeral, and that was probably more meaningful than any, traditional funeral song that he could have played. I've heard all kinds of surprising songs at funerals, and they do more to bring the deceased to mind than, maybe something that you would expect to hear, right?
Absolutely. So, another celebrity whose obituary last month got a lot of attention from well wishers was Markie Post, the TV star who was probably best known in the 1980s for Night Court, but also The Fall Guy, and a little bit more recently, Scrubs.
She was just one of those familiar faces, She was on a lot of TV shows, whether it was just an appearance or recurring role, or these shows that she starred in. I could list, a dozen. And then she was also in the movie There's Something About Mary. And she just really had a very authentic way about her. She always came across in her performances as very genuine, and fans loved her for it. And now hers is a guest book that really isn't filled with these stories that we see in some celebrity guest books, but what it is an outpouring of, I remember her, I loved her, I'm going to miss her. So many entries along those lines. And here are a couple of short ones. Something about the first time I saw Markie on Night Court made me a fan for life. Her banter with John Larroquette used to keep me in stitches. Through the years, I couldn't help falling in love with her. Losing her is like losing a family member. And another one says, I always loved what you did, how you portrayed your characters. You were very real. I hope at last you are at peace. And now I think that's a reference to the fact that she died of cancer and was suffering from that for some time before her death. But now there are always some people who are a little more comfortable expressing their feelings through humor. And here is one guest book message like that. R.I.P. Markie. You were such a talented actress who wore shoulder pads like no other.
I mean, sometimes we laugh so that we don't cry, right?
Absolutely. I there's another thing that I've experienced at funerals is, telling jokes or telling funny stories, and it helps.
Speaking of which, one of the three most active Legacy guest books for headline obituaries last month was for a comedian, Sean Locke.
Yeah, Sean Locke was a British comedian, and he did stand up. He was also a regular on the TV show 8 out of 10 Cats and 8 out of 10 Cats Does Countdown. These were British TV shows that also did air on US TV. So, he had his fans on both sides of the pond. Uh, but what I saw in his guest book was that it was a very British guest book. I think that the majority of the entries were from his UK fans. There's also a strong minority from Australia in there. And I will avoid doing the accent when I read these guest book entries, but I've got a few to share with you. This first one is from someone who found that comfort in comedy. My heart is broken for a light that kept me laughing in a dark bipolar world. A comedian with such incredible artistry, he was my timeout from my troubles. Comedians are my heroes, and the loss is profound. Another entry in Sean Locke's guest book was from someone who really did know him in real life from childhood, and I love when we get these entries in the guest book. It happens sometimes that someone who knew this person before they were famous finds their way to the guest book and tells us a little story. And it's such a fun insight into that person. So here's one of those. Sean, you were the first friend I made at primary school. Our Lady's Convent in Chertsey, circa 1969. You were funny and made everyone laugh even back then. I remember you telling us in class once about how a previous school trip to the Natural History Museum had involved you eating your packed lunch in the blue whale's mouth, much to the delight of those listening.
I love these personal stories where we get this glimpse behind the curtain of someone before they were the version of them that we're familiar with.
Yeah, they're a little bit rare in our guest books, but gosh, when I find one, it's a treat. One other entry that I'll share from Sean Locke's guest book talks about some recent times when the comedian was able to help his fans. In 2020, my family were forced to quarantine due to COVID-19. We commenced a ritual during dinner each night where we'd flick on YouTube and watch an episode of 8 out of 10 Cats Does Countdown. We try and compete, and they became like our nightly dinner guests. And Sean was the panelist that I think Aussies identified with the most. Dry, cutting, absurd, and hysterically funny. It was like inviting a good mate around for a beer and a laugh. My wife and I were shocked to hear the news, and the sadness we felt was as if someone switched off a really bright, beautiful light. Just like that, he was gone. I know we felt it, and I can only imagine what his family feels. It truly is a sad moment. And I think that says it all about this man. He will be missed by those who love him, and he'll be missed by a bloke like me. That was his talent, to connect through his universal ability to make us all laugh. Good on you, Lockie. You were a great one. Safe journey.
That's really lovely.
Yeah, that's a good one.
Sean Locke was one of two major obituary headlines out of the UK last month. The other, of course, was the Rolling Stones' longtime drummer, Charlie Watts, who'd been keeping the band on the beat since 1963.
Yeah, Charlie Watts was one of those drummers who, he wasn't flashy. He didn't, stand out through crazy drum solos or antics or anything like that. He was just rock solid, super talented, kept it simple, and let, the rest of the band take care of the antics. And a lot of people loved him for that.
And he was a sharp dressed man.
Oh, he sure was. Yeah, he was definitely classy. Here are a few entries from Charlie Watts' guest book. You don't have to know someone personally to be affected by their passing. I really was saddened to hear of Charlie Watts' death. Our world needs more people who remain true to themselves, yet loyal to others. Charlie epitomized the very essence of what it means to be classy. He demonstrated admirably that money has nothing to do with it. Condolences to his family and friends. You know what I thought was interesting about that entry is that it doesn't say a word about his music. This person probably also loved the music, but is talking about Charlie Watts as a person, not as a musician.
Well, and it's so interesting because when you're familiar with someone in the context of a group of people like a band,
Mm-hmm.
you're not just observing them in and of themselves, you're observing them in relationship with others. And I feel like that's one of the things people respond to about Charlie Watts. He spent his life working and performing with these hugely over the top personalities, like Mick Jagger and
Yeah,
in his own way Keith Richards. Um, and Watts was kind of the mirror of that.
not flashy, not the one who stood out from the band, but made a lot of difference to the band, through his rhythm and his presence and just kind of as the steady guy, right? Here's another entry from his guest book. I saw the Stones in 1965 before Satisfaction was released. It was early on, but they were tight and unbelievable. The concert came to an abrupt end when the fans stormed the stage. Before leaving his drum kit to drive for safety, Charlie looked at me, a young 14-year-old fan who was sitting behind the stage, and threw me his drumsticks, which I caught. I became an instant school hero when I returned to school the next week. This simple gesture made me a lifelong fan. R.I.P., Charlie. I still have your drumsticks and hope to return them someday.
That's terrific.
I love that story. Just a little thing from all those years ago that I don't know. Do you think Charlie Watts remembered that? I think it is less likely that Charlie Watts remembered this specific moment in his career, but what a moment for a 14-year-old fan. I had one more entry that I pulled from Charlie Watts' guest book that is short and sweet and kind of says it all about how we feel about our celebrity heroes. I have always imagined what I would say to you if I ever got the opportunity to meet you, and now I am speechless.
Again, we see people using the obituary guest books not just to talk to the other mourners who are reading, but to speak directly to the person who's passed.
Yeah, and that last condolence really underlines an aspect of that phenomenon, which is that sometimes when someone we care about dies, we realize that we didn't get a chance to say everything to them that we wanted to. Well, and the guest book is a place where you can do that. As we've said, a lot of people talk directly to the deceased in the guest book. And I think that many of them do feel that, their words are being heard one way or another.
So that brings us to the obituary in August that had the most condolences and sympathy notes left in its guest book on Legacy. That was for Lee Williams, the beloved gospel singer from Tupelo, Mississippi. Tell us what people had to say about Lee Williams.
Lee Williams and the Spiritual QCs, the gospel group that he sang with, started playing together in 1968, but it wasn't until 1990 that they had their first national hit with the song I've Learned to Lean. And they became, really big stars of gospel music, which is a genre that has a large and devoted following, but I don't think that, its stars are generally super famous outside of gospel music. There are certainly a few exceptions to that, gospel singers that everybody knows, but I think Lee Williams was someone who fans just loved, but There may be a lot of people listening who are surprised to hear that our number one most signed guest book from August was not for Charlie Watts or, one of the other, more universally famous people. But, it's a tight-knit community of musicians and fans, and the stars of this genre of gospel are just really loved. So here are a few of the entries from Lee Williams' guest book. You have been such an inspiration in my life. When I needed to be uplifted, I only had to listen to your music or watch a DVD by you. You will be truly missed. That's just a short entry, but it's the sort of thing that I think really speaks to what fans felt about someone like Lee Williams, that uplifting feeling.
For sure.
Yeah. Here's another one. Lee Williams, in my opinion, was the greatest gospel singer ever. My whole family loved Lee Williams and the QCs. I will never forget them coming to Pine Bluff, Arkansas in 1998 or 1999. And then, after I moved to Flint, Michigan, I got a chance to see them in 2017. Lee Williams' songs have gotten me through some real dark periods in my life. When I was feeling down and out, down to my last dime and did not know what to do, his songs uplifted me, and somehow God made a way. Prayers for the family during this difficult time, and thank you for sharing him for over 50 years. That was another one. Uplifting is the word of the day for Lee Williams. That was how people felt about his music, his voice, the band's performances. One more entry from his guest book. My mother transitioned to be with the Lord 6/21/2021. She was his number one fan, and we listened to his music during every hospital visit for 6 entire months. Her homegoing songs were Tell the Angels and He Laid His Hands on Me. Thank you, Lee, for helping us through that emotional time. Now you and Mom are with the Angels jamming.
That really does say it all, doesn't it?
And it's another one, talking about that important decision of what you play at a loved one's funeral. Well, this family probably didn't have to think very hard about that decision. They knew what their mom loved. They knew what she wanted to listen to when she was, in the final months of her life. That's how you remember her.
On that note, that's our show for today. Thank you, Linnea. Thank you to our producer, John Maxwell. And thank you to Legacy.com, where you can now honor a loved one's memory by planting memorial trees in their name. Just visit Legacy.com/trees. To hear more life stories like these that we spoke about today, you can subscribe on your favorite podcast app. You can subscribe to our YouTube channel. Just look up Legacy.com on YouTube. And if you're on Facebook, you can follow Legacy.com there for daily updates. Thanks for listening. See you on the next Immortalized.